what's going on, guys? It's me, Train Man, and welcome back to the Zombie Train, episode 191. There we go. I almost said 181, and then I thought, no, that's a little bit... I feel like we did that one already. So, episode 181. Today we're working on some terrain stuff that I never got to. I'm trying to do, of course, more polishing stuff. We're in the beta phase. So, most of the major functionality of the map is there, if not all of it. I actually did go and replace my speed signs this episode, my 100-mile-per-hour ones that disappeared. And aside from that, everything should be just peachy. I will asterisk. I think I need to. If I don't, somebody else probably should. On the Iron Horseman subreddit, that is reddit.com/r/the Iron Horseman, I want to make a thread for bugs in this map, /fixes/things that need to be worked on, so I know sort of what people want to be done first. And you can talk about that in the comments as well, especially if you've downloaded the map. Anyways, moving on. Speaking of comments, speaking of questions, it is worth pointing out that today's episode... What is going on here? Today's episode is about the Swiss, and this was asked by East Rail back on episode 181. Again, let me crack this open so I get a better look at what's going on here. Let me look at the episode so I can get the actual wording of the quote. Zombie Train, episode 181. Now, I will be honest, there is very little that I can talk about with regard to the Swiss. And that's kind of because... Oh, it was just, did the Swiss say stay neutral? And, yeah. So, the Swiss... I mean, you can't really stay neutral, so to speak, in the sense of the zombie war, but they did remain relatively uninfected. Now, Switzerland is a country... Switzerland... Population. Switzerland is a country of, well, back in 2012, it was about 8 million people. And that's quite a few people. But due to the, basically the politics of Switzerland and due to the way things are, well, first of all, they shut their borders faster than Madagascar in pandemic. And it probably served them extremely well. Now, they, of course, had a couple of cases, but due to the fact that every, I believe every, what's the name for someone that is from Switzerland? Every Swiss individual, I suppose, is trained in the military. At least as far as I understand. They were able to put those down fairly quickly. They had a lot of organization. They were really a shining star in terms of keeping their country together. Sorry about that, needed some water. So, we actually kind of looked to the Swiss, although they never developed the comprehensive sort of zombie, or, anti-zombie movement that we did. And not anti-zombie movement, so to speak, but anti-zombie plan. They never had to invoke the Rediker plan or anything like that, which World War Z, the book, talks about significantly. They never had to do anything like that. They never had any real trouble with... They never had any real trouble with zombies. They did have some trouble with people fleeing the infection, storming into their country, and they held fast. Again, it was impressive to see how much they held back sort of, what would otherwise be basically waves of refugees. And the point is, well, no, Switzerland is in an interesting geographical location. They're very central located. They're bordered by France and Italy and Germany. And it's important to take note of this fact because they have routes of entry into the country sort of all over. And the amazing thing is they didn't struggle to shut down any of them. And I was, as I've said, impressed by what they managed to pull off with all of that organization. Again, they didn't lose any significant portions of their government. They didn't lose any significant portions of their populace. They had, everything they needed. They, of course, didn't have trade anymore, and I won't say they planned for this eventuality, but Switzerland in and of itself is fairly well taken care of in terms of self-sufficiency. They are very good at remaining neutral, as you might figure. They are very good at sort of, holding their own until a war is over, which they've proven time and time again, and this was no exception. Towards the end of the war, or towards the points where things didn't seem so dire, especially out there, now this was probably after the formation of the Zombie Train Incorporated, the war itself lasted on the order of about 5 years, maybe a little bit longer. This sort of a fuzzy beginning, although you can always call it the Great Panic, so December 21st, 2012. And the ending being, sometime in 2017 it was still going on pretty heavily, so 2018, 2019 even, 2020. It depends where you are, where the war kind of ended for you, but in terms of worldwide, decades afterward, you would worry about the zombies. And especially up in Arctic areas where you would have, they'd be frozen in ice for long periods of time, or just areas where they would have otherwise been isolated, and they sort of just crop up. And I'm sure that, it'll sort of go down in myth and legend, and you'll get, parents telling their kids stories for years and years to come. But, the fact of the matter is, it was a very real threat no matter where you looked. And to come back around, the Swiss didn't have hardly any of this fear, because they did whatever they could right away to keep that threat locked down. You won't necessarily say they knew it was coming. They didn't exactly have a premonition like some places did. And some places, well, I wouldn't call it a premonition, they really just got lucky. They sort of guessed right. Just like the few people in reality that have their zombie plans, or rather the few people in a country like the US that have their zombie plans, and have everything sorted out for when that day finally came. It was one of the few countries that sort of worked out well. If something really wrong like this happens, and the rest of the world is going to hell, we sort of know what we're going to do about it. And it was really nice to see somebody that competent. And of course, this is stuff that I found out, or rather, I'm finding out to an extent, but I have found out after the fact, because during the war there was virtually no contact with Switzerland whatsoever. They were trying to stay under the radar. They were trying to, not that the zombies would be attracted by them being active in a global scale, like on radio or something like that, but they were really just trying to stay out of the way. They knew that all hell was breaking loose outside. They knew they certainly didn't have the manpower to do anything about it, so they really didn't. They just fought whatever came to them. And, once again, you'd see hordes and hordes of refugees, and more often than not, people got turned away because Switzerland isn't a very large country, and it's surrounded by very large countries. Well, at least compared to itself. It's sort of like, it's just sort of like if you're trying to take in everyone in the neighborhood into your house. It's not going to work. You might have enough supplies for you and your own, but if you start bringing in people, you're gonna go out of your limits really, really fast. And that's something they wanted to avoid, and it's something they did manage to avoid, at least for the most part. Towards the end of the war, like I said, probably around 2018, and later they did start to give out aid, because Europe as a whole started to come back together around that time. Now, you had Britain, which would never be the same, France, Spain, that were, due to the fact that these countries don't have a particularly large military, nor do they have a sufficiently trained population in, well, firearms. These countries were, well, they were in deep, deep trouble. And that's not to say that, that's not to say that, I don't mean to make a political statement, is what I'm trying to say. But in this case, they were much worse off than the U.S. was, due to the fact that this threat was pretty much omnipresent, and ended up wiping out huge portions of their population. As I've talked about, Britain became another problem entirely. But, Spain, Portugal, Germany to some extent, Germany to a lesser extent, and I'm not quite sure why. I don't know a hell of a lot about the dynamics of what went on in all these European countries. I just know that there was a lot of problems there, and Germany is sort of where it began to peter out. But even the Russians, they took a massively heavy hit in terms of their population. And you had zombies roaming the wastes. Well, you still have them, and they'll be there for decades and decades. And they'll freeze in the winter, and they'll thaw in the spring, and they will come back again. And the people that aren't prepared for them will die. And that's sort of the way it is up there, and that's very dangerous. And it's very similar in Canada, especially if you look at the amount of people that fled up there, and of course many of them died to, other humans as food and firewood and things like that became scarce. But when the zombies showed up, they did show up in droves, and they did take out a lot of the people who were just worn down by the elements. And that was basically how, how you end up with these massive populations of zombies in these frozen, more or less isolated areas and they slowly end up trickling down. They're slowly, I can't say decomposing because they really aren't, but entropy is getting to them. They're losing parts, they're losing pieces, and eventually they're just going to get banged up enough and they come apart enough that they aren't alive anymore. Or they aren't undead, I suppose. But that's, until that happens, there's going to be this omnipresent threat. And once again, to bring it back around to the Swiss, they have this omnipresent threat that's slowly been encroaching on them. And like I said, they do very well with keeping it off, and they do very well, staving it off, as they have since the very beginning. But the Alps are filled with Zaks, and I have no doubt that there will be in hundreds or thousands of years, if not tens of thousands, there's going to be some zombie that was trapped up in a glacier in the Alps, and the glacier is going to melt, and the zombie's going to wander ashore, and it's going to start killing people, and you're going to have a situation all over again. Of course, that really isn't the Swiss' fault. It has nothing to do with them. But that's sort of how I can easily see things going. And hopefully people will sort of take after them in these times, and, the world has gotten a whole new view on what can happen to our world, and the Swiss were very well prepared for it. Just, as I said, it's by chance, really, more than anything. It's not something to scoff at, The United States, despite being what we are, and how quote-unquote prepared we are, it really sort of took us by surprise. And it seemed to be everywhere at once. And once it was, it sort of reached this critical mass, as I've pointed out. You can pinpoint really where it began, but nobody quite knows how it spread, just, through patients and hospitals and things like that. People were getting bitten and then running to the nearest place, not telling, who bit them, what bit them. No explanation necessary, and then them reanimating and attacking doctors, nurses. And this happened all across the globe. And it seemed to happen, like I said, almost simultaneously. And it didn't not happen in Switzerland. They just happened to be very on the ball about it. And then, of course, they barred pretty much everything else. Whereas, the United States, it struck us just like it did anyone else, and we got kind of taken by it fairly quickly. Possibly due to high population density in a lot of places. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Feel free to keep asking questions, and I will see you next week. Now, Again, for people who want a little bit more understanding, check out World War Z by Max Brooks. Trainman out.